We begin in Washington tonight, where U.S. lawmakers are taking a closer look at two deadly crashes involving Boeing planes. Appearing before them today, a Canadian man who lost his wife, 3 children, and mother-in-law in the second crash last March. He wants to see some major changes to the aviation industry, and he says Boeing executives should be held criminally liable.
I think about the last 6 minutes a lot. My wife and my mom-in-law knew they were going to die. They had to somehow comfort the children during those final moments, knowing they were all their last. I wish I was there with them. If Boeing's wrongful conduct continues, another plane will dive to the ground, killing me, you, or your children, or your members, or all other members of your family. It is you who must be the leaders in this fight for aviation safety in the world.
And our Katie Simpson followed that testimony in Washington earlier this afternoon. She joins us now. Hi, Katie. Thanks for being with us. Tell us a bit more about what was involved today and what we heard.
Well, this is a story that we've been hearing about quite often in Canada, and it's unusual for a Canadian to be brought forward to an American committee like this. But this investigation and this committee is trying to expand their mandate and try to really take a closer look at what has happened that led to these 2 deadly plane crashes. And they wanted to hear from family members. And that's how this Canadian man and his heartbreaking story became included in this committee and this committee hearing. He spoke about what kind of changes he and other families, victims' families, want to see happen. He very much squarely puts the blame for what is going on Boeing. He says that his family did not need to die, his 3 young children, his wife, his mother-in-law, saying that if Boeing had taken proper action after the first crash had taken place, that the second crash could have been preventable. He says he isn't sleeping, he's angry, he's frustrated, he's sad. And we spoke with him after his testimony today, where he laid out those changes he wants to see. He wants to see leaders at Boeing fired. He wants to see the company focus more on safety rather than profit. He wants to see the American Federal Aviation Authority that regulates safety. He wants it to have a bigger budget to focus more on safety. And those specific planes in question, he wants to see them completely reconfigured and recertified to make sure that they are actually safe. Now, as you know, those planes have been grounded all around the world, as there are more than 300 families that are trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives after these 2 deadly crashes. We spoke with him about how he is trying to just continue on with his life, and have a listen.
I go through a lot of difficulties, and it's a struggle to even wake up and try to do anything any day. And the little strength that I have comes from the messages of hope that people send to me. The best therapy that I got was when I met with the families of the other victims. I have not been able to go back to work. I don't know if I'll ever be able to work again. I think it's going to take a lot for me to even ever have the half of the zeal and the zest that I had in the past.
When Paul Girauds was speaking about a lot of the challenges that he just experiences in his everyday life now, the room was completely silent, and lawmakers, those American lawmakers, were visibly impacted. You can tell it was an awful story to hear, and they certainly didn't want to be brought together under these circumstances, listening to how much this is just one man, one of the more than 300 victims' family members, what his daily life is like now.
You mentioned sort of what he's hoping to see from Boeing. What is Boeing saying today?
Boeing did a re-announcement today. So there are a number of different investigations underway into what happened in both of these crashes. The initial thoughts from investigators are that the same software problem led to both of these deadly crashes. However, investigations are still underway, and as I mentioned, these planes, they're grounded around the world right now. Boeing had previously announced it would be putting $100 million into a victim compensation fund, and they were originally going to give it to different NGOs and governments to then give it out to the family members. However, today they sort of did a re-announcement saying 50 million of that will start to be sent out soon, they say, and they hired someone who did the 9/11 compensation packages in New York City to sort of lead that effort. Now, we did hear from a number of people raising concerns about how Boeing has dealt with the families in this situation. We heard from Paul. He said that he hasn't received any money at this point, and he really is struggling with how this company has handled this. And some lawmakers, including one Democrat, really picked up on that. Have a listen.
When I read your testimony, the fact that you said that Boeing has never reached out to the families really stuck out to me, and I would like to hear you comment on that publicly because I think that's really important.
They've apologized to the families in front of cameras. Now, they know who the next of kin of these victims are, but they've not come to us and they've not apologized in person.
Boeing has not testified at these committee hearings, but that's something the families would like to see happen.
All right, thank you, Katie. Thanks so much. The CBC's Katie Simpson for us from Washington. So should the U.S. adopt these recommendations, and how much responsibility is Boeing likely to bear for the plane crashes? Sam Baroni served as vice chair of the Canadian Transport Agency from 2013 to 2018. He's now the principal and founder of the Transportation Advisory Group based in Vancouver. Mr. Baroni joins us now from Vancouver. Hi there, nice to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
Good afternoon, Vashi.
So we've been discussing with Katie the calls before this committee today, essentially for more scrutiny on not only Boeing's actions, but the actions of the FAA. Do you think those calls are warranted?
They are absolutely warranted because ultimate regulatory oversight falls with the FAA with respect to the certification of aircraft as they become manufactured. So there has to be accountability and oversight because regulatory agencies such as the FAA and others have a duty of care both to the flying public and the crews that fly those aircraft to ensure that they've been designed and are safe to fly.
If you could help me and our viewers understand, because there seems to have been a change that occurred in the early 2000s in which that type of certification was delegated to the actual airlines themselves, or the manufacturers, themselves. Can you sort of explain how that occurred and what the reasoning behind that was, and if you think that contributed to anything going on right now?
The FAA at the time did what is called delegated authorities and to the manufacturers such as Boeing, so that not every detail has to be certified or overseen directly once it gets filed. So the aircraft gets designed, it then gets certified, and the FAA will look at what went into the certification by those Boeing engineers and designers. So that was a bit of regulatory outsourcing which happened, and that may be a factor in this case, which isn't conclusive yet, but it's something that did occur at the time and probably was in place when the 737 MAX was being designed.
Do you think that needs to be re-examined, that whole process?
I think that process has to be re-examined. You could have joint accountabilities, but ultimately the regulator has to have oversight over that manufacturing process. So that's something that the congressional committee in the United States will have to look at and perhaps change the enabling legislation covering the FAA.
When this whole thing first happened, there was a lot of discussion around grounding the planes, what country did what and when. And certainly you know a lot more than the rest of us about the interplay kind of between Canada's regulatory body and Transport Canada and the FAA. What can you tell us, or what can you sort of, shed some light on the relationship between those two bodies?
Well, it goes beyond just the FAA and Transport Canada Civil Aviation Safety Group in Ottawa. It's actually, because the industry is global, all these interplays are on a global basis because aircraft fly not only within Canada and to and from the United States, they fly essentially all over the world. So that interplay is there. And fortunately in Canada and the United States, the 737 MAX had a record that was very safe. That doesn't mean to say that there weren't design issues or software issues. It just means that pilots in both Canada and the United States had information available to them which allowed Transport Canada and the industry able to adopt special procedures in terms of the training and simulator training that went into it, and had the other airlines globally had similar information and special operating procedures in place, they too would have been able to mitigate that risk. It's about mitigating the risk. So Transport Canada has working relationships not only with the FAA but other airworthiness partners that we have, for example, in the EU, Brazil, China, and other countries, because all the airlines need to share information on airworthiness. So, you know, the issue is can we take what the FAA gives in terms of other jurisdictions in terms of airworthiness and civil aviation authorities at face value? And
what do you think?
I think, in my view, quite frankly, we do have a robust system in Canada, because we have our own procedures for reviewing based on the information that we receive. So we manage our own risks based on operating conditions in Canada, for example.
So you think that it is separate enough that the Canadian decision can be made independent independent enough of the FAA, or is there too much reliance, do you think, on what the FAA decides?
I don't think there's too much reliance on what the FAA decides. Canada is doing its own investigation right now in terms of the 737 MAX grounding and the design issues. We have 3 airlines in Canada that are operating more than approximately 41 aircraft actually, in terms of the Boeing 737 MAX model. So Transport Canada is doing its own investigation. The EU is doing its own investigation. Then there's the congressional investigation. And then on top of that, there's a sort of a multilateral, multi-jurisdictional investigation where you have the FAA, Transport Canada, the EU, China, Ethiopia, Indonesia working, and the National Transportation Safety Board is chairing that investigation as well, which is made up of many experts and groups looking into the design situation and what needs to be changed and so forth.
Eventually, Transport Canada and others in other parts of the world are going to decide whether or not to put these planes back in operation. And I'm wondering, just as someone who's been on the other side of it, what kind of a mountain do you think it will be to climb, regardless of whatever decision they make, given the amount of public skepticism there is right now and sort of public awareness about this whole thing?
Well, you're absolutely right. The airworthiness or the civil aviation authorities of Canada and indeed the United States, the EU, they will all have to recertify the Boeing 737 MAX and make sure that it is going to be airworthy and safe for crews and customers alike. And, you know, we're living in an age of social media where customers have instant information. They keep track more of what kind of aircraft types they fly on. And they're very informed traveling public. So there's a psychological consumer awareness issue that has to, and the confidence has to be there. But at the end of the day, crews have to be comfortable so that customers will need to be comfortable in flying those aircraft.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Baroni. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Vashi.
That's Sam Baroni of the Transportation Advisory Group, coming to us from Vancouver. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.